Somewhere in the Alps more than 5,000 years ago, a man is dying. He doesn't know it yet, not exactly, but his knees ache constantly. His lower back is a mess, and there's a spot on his lung that's been slowly worsening for years. And across his body, on his lower spine, behind his left knee, around both ankles, are simple, dark lines, dozens of them burned or cut into his skin and rubbed with soot until they turned permanent. He's going to die on that mountain, and his frozen body is going to be found over 5,000 years later in 1991 by two hikers in the Austrian Alps. We call him Ötzi, and when researchers scanned his body, they found 61 tattoos. 61 on a man who lived over 5,000 years ago, before writing, before metal tools were common, before almost anything we think of as civilization had really begun. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. When researchers cross-referenced the location of every single tattoo with modern medical imaging of his body, something remarkable happened. Almost every tattoo sat directly over a joint or a region, showing signs of degeneration, arthritis in his knees, wear in his lower spine, the exact places where a man doing hard physical labor for decades would have been in the most pain. Ötzi wasn't decorating himself. There's a real chance he was treating himself. This is the story of tattoos, and it's a much stranger, older, and more emotionally complicated story than almost anyone realizes. Because right now, tattoos feel like a modern thing. Something you get at 23 because you liked how it looked. Something your parents maybe didn't approve of. Something tied up in identity and rebellion and self-expression. But that entire framework, tattoos as personal style, is incredibly recent. For most of the tens of thousands of years, humans have been marking their skin permanently. It had almost nothing to do with looking cool. Let's go back to the actual evidence, because this is one of those topics where the archaeology is genuinely stunning once you start looking at it properly. Ötzi isn't the oldest tattooed human ever discovered. He's just the most famous, mostly because his body was so remarkably preserved by the ice that scientists could examine him, almost like he died last week rather than 5,000 years ago. But there are older examples. Ancient Egyptian mummies dating back over 4,000 years have been found with tattoos, including a woman known to researchers as the Amunet mummy, decorated with patterns of dots and dashes across her abdomen and thighs. For a long time, historians assumed these markings on Egyptian women meant something sexual, or that the women themselves were dancers or entertainers of low social status. More recent research has pushed back hard on that assumption, and now many Egyptologists believe the tattoos may have actually been connected to fertility, protection during pregnancy, or healing, placed specifically in locations associated with the womb and lower abdomen. In other words, generations of male historians looked at tattooed ancient women and assumed the worst, when the actual explanation might have been medical and deeply practical the whole time. That pattern, by the way, is going to come up again and again in this video, and it should make you a little suspicious of every confident claim you've ever heard about what ancient tattoos meant. Then there's the truly staggering discovery from Siberia. In the Altai Mountains, archaeologists excavated the frozen tomb of a woman now known as the Siberian Ice Maiden, a Prehistoric noblewoman who died around 2,500 years ago. Her body, preserved in permafrost for millennia, revealed something that genuinely stunned researchers when it was uncovered. Elaborate tattoos covering both arms, depicting griffins, deer with impossibly elongated antlers curling into spirals, mythical creatures rendered with a level of artistic sophistication that looks almost unbelievable for something etched into human skin 2,500 years ago. This wasn't a simple dot pattern for pain relief. This was fine art. Someone in that society had the skill, the tools, and the reputation to be trusted with permanently marking another human being's body in a design that intricate and that tells you something important. By 2,500 years ago, in at least some cultures, tattooing wasn't a fringe practice done in secret. It was a respected craft. So already you've got two completely different explanations sitting side by side in the archaeological record. Medicine on one end, elite artistic status on the other. And that's really the heart of this whole story, because tattoos didn't have one origin. They had many, invented and reinvented independently across cultures that had zero contact with each other, all arriving at roughly the same ideal through completely different reasoning. Let's talk about the medical theory a bit more, because it's the one that surprises people the most, and it might actually be one of the oldest motivations of all. The logic isn't as strange as it sounds once you think it through. Ancient humans had no anesthesia, no anti-inflammatories in the form we understand them, and chronic pain, especially joint pain, from decades of physical labor, was simply a permanent condition you lived with, but they weren't without any tools at all. Many cultures independently discovered a technique researchers now sometimes call therapeutic tattooing, essentially a primitive form of acupuncture acupuncture combined with controlled irritation of the skin, applied directly over painful joints. Modern researchers studying Ötzi's tattoo placement noted that several of his markings correspond closely to acupuncture points still used in traditional Chinese medicine today. Thousands of years before written records of acupuncture exist in China, whether Ötzi's culture and later Chinese medical traditions arrived at this idea independently, or whether it reflects some far older, far more widespread body of practical medical knowledge we've simply lost most of the evidence for, is a genuine open question archaeologists still debate. Think about what that actually means. A man in agonizing pain from decades of walking mountainous terrain found something that helped. Maybe it was controlled irritation triggering a real physiological pain response. Maybe it was some form of counter-stimulation we don't fully understand even now. Maybe there was a placebo element mixed in. But it worked well enough, or was believed to work well enough, that he kept doing it over and over at new sites as new pains appeared. 61 times. A man was quite literally covered in the equivalent of prehistoric pain management, and we only know this because a hiker happened to find his frozen body over 5,000 years later. But medicine is only one thread. Let's talk about the one that probably comes to mind first when people think about ancient tattoo. Across dozens of cultures with zero contact with each other, spanning continents and thousands of years, tattoos repeatedly show up as a marker of achievement, rank, or survival. Among certain Polynesian cultures, the tradition of tatau, the actual origin of the English word tattoo, involved intricate, painful, sometimes days-long tattooing rituals that marked a person's genealogy, status, and personal accomplishments in a language of symbols, readable by anyone in the culture who understood the visual code. A person's entire life story, their family line, their achievements, their rank, could be read directly off their skin by someone who knew how to look. This wasn't decoration in the way we think of decoration today. It was closer to a permanent wearable resume, except one that couldn't be faked, because the tattooing process itself was often so physically demanding that surviving it was part of what made the mark legitimate. In some Arctic indigenous cultures, including certain Inuit traditions, facial tattoos worn by women marked significant life transitions, coming of age, marriage, motherhood, achievements within the community. These tattoos weren't hidden or private. They were meant to be read immediately, on site, by everyone in the community. A visible record of who you were and what you had done, worn permanently on the most visible part of your body. And then there's a category that's darker and worth being honest about, because sanitizing history rarely serves anyone. In some ancient societies, tattoos and similar permanent body markings were used as punishment, marking criminals, enslaved people, or prisoners of war in ways that were deliberately meant to be permanent and impossible to hide. A kind of forced visibility used to strip away anonymity and control. The same technology, the same basic act of putting permanent marks into skin could mean an incredible honor in one context and a brutal punishment in another, entirely dependent on who was holding the needle and who was deciding what the mark meant. That's genuinely strange when you sit with it. The exact same physical act, ink or pigment pushed under skin, could represent the highest honor a warrior could earn, a medical treatment for chronic pain, a spiritual protection for a pregnant woman, or a forced brand of ownership and control. The needle didn't care what it meant, only the people around it did. Now here's a question that should be sitting in the back of your mind by now, and it's one worth taking seriously. Why does this keep happening independently over and over in cultures that had absolutely no way of communicating with each other? Polynesia, Siberia, Egypt, the Arctic, ancient Britain, where Julius Caesar himself wrote that the native tribes dyed themselves with woad to appear more frightening in battle. Different continents, different millennia, no shared origin, and yet somehow, across all of it, humans kept independently arriving at the same basic idea. Mark the body permanently and let that mark mean something. There's a theory among some anthropologists that this points to something deeper than coincidence, something almost built into how humans think about identity and permanence. Your body is the one thing you always carry with you. It's the one canvas that exists in every culture, requires no external materials to display, and can never be taken away from you the way clothing or possessions can. If you wanted to say something permanent, something that couldn't be lost, stolen, or left behind, your own skin was the most reliable surface available. In a world without photographs, without written records for most of human history, without any external way to preserve a memory or an achievement, the body itself became the archive. A tattoo wasn't just an image, it was a form of memory storage, encoded directly into the one thing that would stay. And that idea that your body can hold information your mind might eventually lose might explain something else too. Grief tattoos and mourning markings appear across an enormous range of ancient and traditional cultures. Marks made specifically to commemorate someone someone who died. Some researchers believe certain lines on ancient Egyptian mummies and markings found in some other ancient burial contexts may represent exactly this, a permanent physical record of loss worn by the living for the dead, because words fade from memory, but a mark on skin does not. Let's come back to the tools for a second, because the technology itself tells its own story. The earliest tattooing methods likely involved simply rubbing ash or pigment directly into an open wound or cut. An accidental discovery probably made the same way fire and cooking were, through injury and observation rather than deliberate invention. Someone got a cut near a fire, ash got into the wound, and when it healed, the mark stayed. Somebody noticed. Somebody at some point thought, what if I did that on purpose? Later, more sophisticated cultures developed dedicated tattooing tools, bone needles, sharpened wood, and eventually metal implements, alongside pigments made from charcoal, plant dyes, and mineral compounds. Refined recipes passed down and improved across generations, exactly the same way herbal medicine or tool-making knowledge would have been. The pain involved in getting tattooed with these ancient tools would have been immense, far beyond what modern tattoo machines produce, which raises an important point that connects everything back together. If it hurt that much, and it clearly did, the fact that humans kept choosing to do it over and over across every culture we've mentioned tells you the meaning attached to the mark had to be worth more than the pain of receiving it. Nobody accidentally gets 61 tattoos. Nobody accidentally endures a multi-day tattooing ritual for status they didn't actually want. The pain wasn't a side effect people tolerated. In many cultures, the pain was part of the point, proof that the mark and the person wearing it had earned what it represented. So why did ancient humans start getting tattoos? The honest answer is that they didn't start for one reason, because it wasn't one invention. It was dozens of separate human beings in dozens of separate places, independently arriving at the same realization that the body itself could be used to say something permanent, whether that something was, I am in pain and this helps, or I have earned my place in this community, or I loved someone and I'm not letting the world forget them, or in its darkest form, you belong to someone else now and everyone will know it. What connects a 5,000-year-old man in the Alps, silently tattooing acupuncture points onto his own aching joints, to a Polynesian warrior enduring days of pain to have his genealogy permanently inscribed into his skin, to a Siberian noblewoman commissioning griffins onto her arms as a mark of status? To you right now, however you feel about tattoos personally, is this single, strange, distinctly human idea that your body doesn't just have to survive. It can also remember, it can also speak, it can carry something forward that words alone, in a world without writing, without photographs, without any other way to preserve a life, could never fully hold on to on their own. Ötzi never got to explain his tattoos to anyone. He died alone on that mountain, and for over 5,000 years, his marks meant nothing to anyone but him. And then 2 hikers found him, and scientists spent decades trying to read what his own skin had been quietly saying the entire time. That a man was in pain, that he tried something to fix it, that it apparently worked well enough that he kept doing it, again and again, until there was almost nowhere left on his aching body that hadn't been marked. We tend to think the story a tattoo tells belongs to the person wearing it in the moment they choose it. But Ötzi's story wasn't finished when he died. It was finished thousands of years later in a laboratory by people reading a language written directly onto human skin in the oldest dialect our species ever developed for saying something permanent about who we are.